recap, all the sons of Jacob are now gone, and the Pharaoh that had elevated Joseph into his high position is also gone, and the population of the Hebrews is increased to the point that one of the future pharaohs has become worried about the possibility of them becoming strong enough to rise up and rebel against them in a similar way to that of the Hyksos. We talked about those people last time. So, hi Chris. So Pharaoh devises a series of plans, one worse than the next, and to keep the Hebrews in check. It started out with 400 years of servitude in brick-making and farm labor, and they followed somewhere along the line by ordering the midwives to kill the newborn males. And then finally, requiring all Egyptians to throw newborn Hebrew male babies into the Nile. And into this mess, Moses is born to a Levite family, and he gets hidden for 3 months. Then he's set adrift in the Nile. Then he's picked up and adopted by a daughter of Pharaoh, given back to his mother to be raised for 3 years, and then until the age 40, spending those years in the household of Pharaoh. And then at the age of 40, Moses is wandering among the Hebrews, who he knows as his people, and he kills an Egyptian taskmaster. And this gets back to Pharaoh, who puts out a warrant for Moses' arrest and causing Moses to flee to the land of Midian until he arrives at a well. That's where we ended up. And Harvey, can we start with you? Could you read 16 through 22, please?
On in
Chapter 2.
Okay. Now the priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to rule their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" So they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son, and named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land."
So here we have the account of how Moses gets his wife and ends up in the household of Reuel in the land of Midian. And we're going to learn later that this arrangement goes on for the second 40-year segment of Moses' life. Now, the Midianites were actually descendants of Abraham through Keturah, who was his wife following the death of Sarah. And so Moses is actually related to the Midianites, although it's from a long ways back. And here we see that this Reuel is a priest of Midian, but it doesn't say here what God he served. And we know the priesthood has not been established by God yet. And the priesthood wasn't actually established until Mount Sinai. So these Midianites had priests, but as far as we know, the Hebrews in Egypt had none. So we don't know if we're talking about a remnant beside the sons of Jacob who still worship Yahweh God. And the narrative here doesn't tell us how long Moses was in the land of Midian prior to arriving at the well. Now, but once again, we see how Moses reacts to injustice. And he not only stands up for these women, but he helps them water their flock. And so these daughters go home and they tell Dad what happened. And they identified Moses as an Egyptian. And so there had to have been something in his mannerisms, his behavior, his dress, his speech, something that was recognizable. And so Moses must have still had some Egypt in him. And it took God sitting there in Midian for 40 years to get the Egypt out of him. And we see in this account, so we see in this account an example of the hospitality expectations of the culture there. And not only did Moses do a good turn for the daughters, but he was a weary traveler with nowhere to stay in a harsh land. And we aren't told what the relationship between the Egyptians and the Midianites was at this time, but to fail to provide for him was not an option. And now Moses is content to stay in Reuel's household, and he ends up with one of his daughters as his wife, and in time Moses becomes a father. And has anyone else ever wondered if Moses had been married in Egypt? He was there, he was 40 years old when he escaped to Midian, and it would have been unusual for him not to have been married. But there's no mention of this made in Scripture, so it's always puzzled me about that. Janny, you want to read 23 through 24, please?
During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked, oh, that's the next verse, oh well. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them.
Oh yeah, did I say 24? I mean, yeah, the whole thing.
Okay,
25.
good. I went ahead.
Yeah, good for you, 'cause that's, yeah. All right, sometime during the next 40-year portion of Moses' life, the Pharaoh that he had run from died, but that didn't change the plight of the Hebrews, and they rightly were moaning and groaning about it, and they wanted to be rescued from their situation. And it doesn't say who they were crying out to, but God was aware of all this. And when it says that God remembered his covenant, it doesn't mean he went, oh shoot, I've forgotten all about these poor people. It's kind of like, in Genesis, when it says that God remembered Noah, he doesn't say, oh my gosh, I've forgotten all about poor Noah in that stinky, crowded boat. Now remember, Western thinking, Eastern thinking, okay? Now, we regard remembering as something that only occurs in your brain, okay? But to an Easterner, remembering meant that something needed to be done, and it was time to do it, remember, interior, exterior. So God remembering his covenant means that he had never forgotten about it, and it was time to act, right?
Gotcha.
Yeah, so let's go to chapter 3.
I have a question before you
Okay.
go on. We've been reading in Exodus, and how is it that they don't say Abraham, Isaac, and Israel?
Well, because Jacob was actually his name as he was born.
Yeah.
And so God gave him a new name, Israel.
Right,
But
exactly.
even God never refers to him as Israel. He calls him Jacob.
Right.
But then it's the Israelites,
Yeah, but
not the
but
Jacobites.
typically when you see the word Israel, it refers to them
To the
as
nation.
a nation.
I see.
Not a person.
Gotcha.
Do we ever really see Gershom showing back up again much?
I don't
There's a
think
couple
so.
lineages that I saw, the sons of Moses, Gershom, but he doesn't really play much of a prominent role. He doesn't.
No, in fact, there's a lot of people in the Bible who only get one shot at it.
Yeah.
They're there for one
One hit
person,
wonder.
that's it.
Yeah, one hit wonders, yeah.
Like, Matthias, when he was,
True.
when he was made one of the 12, to take Judas's place,
No.
never hear from him
no,
again.
That's right.
Yeah, you don't know. God knows, and who knows, they might have done something pretty cool. But we won't know that yet.
They just become footnotes in history.
Yeah. Okay. Chris, if you do 1 through 6.
I have a question. In 25, there's a different translation. It was interesting. Yours said God
Looked on
God looked on them, and then what?
and was concerned.
And was concerned. So the ESV says God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So there's a significant difference there. God was concerned. God knew. I'm
Right.
wondering about that wordage. That's
NESV says God took notice of them.
Huh.
Yeah, don't know.
That's interesting.
I don't have any footnotes to tell me about that either, so
That's
I'll
interesting.
have that here.
I'm taking beginning Hebrew this fall.
Oh.
Okay, well, come back with a report when you do.
Yeah, exactly. Get into Exodus.
Give me 2 or 3 years, I'll actually know what it meant. It's like,
You know the difference.
it won't happen in a basic Hebrew
Sure.
test.
Tell us the difference between a jot and a
I
tittle.
can tell you what.
Yeah, exactly.
I can tell you what letters they are.
Okay, Chris, 1 through 6, please.
Now Moses was tending to the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within the bush. Moses saw, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange which does not burn. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer. God said, Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God.
Now, you notice here the use of the name Jethro instead of Reuel.
Yes.
It was not uncommon for people to have more than one name to be used under different circumstances. And it's been suggested that one of the names is a priestly name.
Oh.
But
Oh,
Jethro
gotcha.
is how he will be referred to as in the rest of the book. So now we have Moses. He's 40 years into his stay in Jethro's house. He's out doing his thing as an 80-year-old shepherd, which could have been unusual since keeping the flock was, in most of the cultures of the time, reserved for the younger family members, and quite often the girls. And you'll remember King David was the youngest in the family, in his family, so he was
True.
stuck with the sheep. But it doesn't seem like, to me, like a very ambitious career path for someone who was raised for 40 years in Pharaoh's household. But apparently he was content with it, and maybe there weren't a lot of better choices in Midian in those days, especially for people on the run. But we know God doesn't waste those years, because Moses learns a lot about how to live in the desert and to how to lead sheep. This is knowledge he's going to need later. And God doesn't waste our experiences either, whether they're good experiences or whether they're wilderness experiences.
Right.
God uses those to shape us into the person that he needs us to be to fulfill whatever purpose he has for our lives. Now, since we don't know the exact borders of Midian at this time, we don't know where the west side of the wilderness was.
Oh.
And especially since it was all wilderness all around there. But at some times, Midian is typically listed on your maps as over here on the west side, the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba. But there were times which when the borders of Midian expanded over into the Sinai. So we don't really know for sure where the west side of the wilderness is here. Now, Horeb, which is Hebrew for wasteland, is described here as the mountain of God. It's identified in chapter 19 with Mount Sinai. But some commentators think Horeb is a place name, and it refers to the region where Mount Sinai is found. Horeb is referred to many times in the Bible, but it's only mentioned once as Mount Horeb. All right, but God identifies with this mountain for some reason. It was believed that that ancient Near Eastern deities had their dwelling places on mountaintops, and we see that again in the Greeks and the Romans too. So, but in chapter 19, when they arrive at Mount Sinai, God says, "I have brought you to myself." Now, in verse 2, it says, oh, wait a minute. Make sure I didn't turn too many pages there.
Ooh, he's balancing coffee.
Yep, I guess I'm in the right place. All right, verse 2, it says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses." But very soon in the narrative, it's apparent that the words were God's words. And this strongly suggests that this is not an ordinary angel or ordinary messenger, but it was common in ancient cultures for a king to have a person designated as his mouth, someone who would speak accurately the words of the king. And this could have even been God himself doing the talking, we really don't know. But what Moses is actually seeing is not very clear here. It says the angel appeared in the flames of the fire in the midst of the bush. But what was he seeing? Was it a figure in the flame, or was it just a voice coming out of the fire? More unanswered questions. But when God wanted to present himself to humans, we find many times in Scripture that he does this as a flame of fire. And this is an indication of his presence. So what attracted Moses was that the bush wasn't being consumed by the fire. Now, this is not an everyday occurrence. And it apparently he stood and watched it long enough to see that this was happening. And eventually, his curiosity gets the best of him, and he decides he's going to move in and take a closer look and try to figure out why. But God caught him before he could get too close. Apparently, God thought that this was not a good idea. And God informs Moses that this is no ordinary place. But it wasn't anything about the place itself that made it holy. It was the presence of God that made it holy. And because of God's presence in this place, he won't even let Moses bring his dirty sandals into it. In Egyptian writing, there are a lot of depictions of subjects approaching Pharaoh barefoot. There was a sense that the area around Pharaoh was a sacred place. And God is holy, and he is the one who makes or declares people or places to be holy. And it's only in relation to God that holiness is properly understood. God says, "Be holy, for I am holy." And I've wondered, is this a command? Or is God saying, "You are holy, for I am holy"? But it's only in relationship with God that anyone or anything is holy. And without God, nothing is holy. Now you're going to notice in verse 6 how God identifies himself to Moses. Now Moses likely knew full well who his ancestors were. And God says, "I'm the same God they worshipped." And it's impossible to know how much the Hebrews knew about their history, and particularly of the covenant relationship that God had with Abraham and with his early offspring. But God's making it clear that he is not one of the gods of the Egyptians. And one has to wonder what the Hebrews thought of this God by this time. Now, they'd been brought into Egypt and they did well. But for the last 400 years, it sure looked as though their God either didn't think a whole lot of them, or that he wasn't powerful enough to bail them out of their poor circumstances. But by the end of verse 6, Moses realized that he is in the presence of a genuine God. And so he hides his face, worried that things might not be going to go well for him here. All right, let's read on.
Before you read on,
Yeah.
there's something that astonishes me here. I didn't know about the idea that the Egyptians would take their sandals off to go in the presence of Pharaoh sometimes. What strikes me is that God revealed his holiness to Moses in a way that he could culturally understand.
Absolutely.
And he does the same to us. So if it would have been us in American culture going before God, he probably wouldn't have said, "Hey, take your shoes off." He'd have said, "Why? Doesn't make any sense to us."
Right.
But he did it in such a way that Moses could understand
Absolutely.
the gravity of the situation.
And you're
and
going
the
to see
greatness
this
of the one
again
king
very
before him.
graphically portrayed before we get to the end of this chapter. You're going to see it again. Good catch. Okay, Jake, you want to read 7 through 12, please?
Sure. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses said to God, "Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain."
God's going to do a little explaining here. He's going to tell Moses why he's here and what all this has to do with Moses. Now in verse 7, God refers to the Hebrews as my people. And these are special people to God, and he's claimed them as his own. And this is how Moses will identify them to Pharaoh later on. Now Pharaoh will learn that these people have their own God, and it is not Pharaoh. Now God then informs Moses that he has knowledge of what's going on. God says, I have seen, I have heard, and I know. None of this is a secret to God, and he has known all from the beginning, and it is all part of the plan. He tells Moses that this is going to come to an end, and God himself will deliver them. And the place where they will be going is a good, prosperous land. And God's going to give it to them, even though it's occupied by these various tribes, some of whom are pretty strong. And this is the same land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the other shoe drops. And God informs Moses that Moses will be the one to do the bringing. Now this is an 80-year-old guy just trying to keep his sheep in one place. So you can imagine the shock. Now Moses reacts with, hey, you've got the wrong guy. Which I think is a reasonable response, and probably the way I would have responded as well.
Yeah.
Moses knows that there is nothing special about him. Who am I? He asks. And I want you to notice here too, that God doesn't answer his question. Or he doesn't try to convince Moses there's anything special about him. Instead, he tries to reassure Moses with, I will be with you. Now, I don't know how reassuring this is to Moses, since God had waited 400 years for this. Look what they've been through. Moses had to have been wondering why God hadn't done this already if he was this good. But throughout the Old Testament, when it says God was with someone, it's an indication of God's power that enables one to do what God has called them to do. And this is still true today.
But
God's-
he hadn't seen any of that, though.
What's that?
He hadn't seen
No,
God
we haven't.
that way.
We haven't. We absolutely
Yeah.
haven't. Yeah.
But up to this point, Moses has been very acquainted with, I mean, he was very well educated. He clearly had a physical stature to be imposing. Obviously to kill the other Egyptian servant, and then be physically imposing enough to take on the other shepherds that were harassing and run them off. So it seems like he had been raised, or up to this point, been very dependent on his own ability to execute what needed to be done. And that had been his mentality. It's like, I'm smart, I'm strong, I can get things done, I will go do this. But God's preparing him for something that he can't do himself. It's
That's right.
that there's now this dependency that's now, the poor in spirit of the Beatitudes is now getting injected to say that, I mean, to help him realize it's like, it's not gonna be dependent on, your intelligence isn't gonna get them there, your strength isn't gonna get them there, your background isn't gonna get them there, it's gonna be your dependence on God that's gonna get, because God is going to get you there.
That's right.
And you have to unlearn this now, and it's gonna be another 40 years to unwind that mentality. It's
That's right.
like,
That's right. Yeah, and you know, and God, and even today though, God still uses ordinary people
absolutely,
to
yeah.
do extraordinary things. And
Yeah.
if God places a call in someone's life, he will provide what is needed here. So God's telling Moses, I know you aren't special, but I am.
Yeah, exactly.
And as further reassurance, God tells Moses that when Moses has brought the people out, he will be right back here at this mountain worshiping God. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone tells me to go and do something, and then tells me that something will occur afterwards as proof that it has happened, I don't find that very reassuring. I would tend to want my proof ahead of time. Okay? But I guess what God is saying to Moses is, when you find yourself right back here with your 1 to 2 million sheep, you realize it was I who brought you here because you couldn't have gotten here any other way.
Yeah.
So, Moses is going to ask God here.
Yeah, Jake has.
Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
yeah, Jake.
You mentioned that that your version had a different word for the word concerned.
Oh, yeah.
Back in chapter 2, verse 25.
Yeah.
What did it say in verse 7? Because it uses that word concerned
3:7.
again. Yes.
3:7. Surely I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of testimonies. I know their sufferings.
No again. Okay. Okay. I just wanna see if how it translated the same way there too. Sorry.
Okay,
Okay.
cool. All right, let's go. April, do you want to do 13 through 16, please?
Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moreover, God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you and seen what is done to you in Egypt.
All right, so Moses here asks God a very important question. Now, the gods of Egypt had names, and he knew his people would want to know what God Moses is talking about. And so as to differentiate between this God and all the others, God is going to answer Moses in a way he would have understood having been raised in an Egyptian culture. Now, in Egypt, as in many Middle Eastern cultures of the time, there was a close relationship between the name of the deity and the deity itself. The name of a god would reveal something about the essential nature of that god, some action or some characteristic associated with the god. And oftentimes, there was a play on words in the god's name. So when God answers Moses, the first thing he says to him is, I am who I am. Now, this is not God's name. God is revealing something about his nature or character here. He can be identified as one who is self-existent, who is not himself created. He is not dependent on anything else for his creation, and is eternal in his existence. He is who he is, and he is not in the process of becoming something else.
So he doesn't really answer the question.
Not yet. So let me give you an alternate explanation here suggested by one source. It's kind of neat here. So when the Hebrews will ask, what's my name? Or what is his name? Moses wants to know what to say to him. And God responds, I am who I am. This commentator says it simply means they know exactly who he is. It's who he's always been.
He gives his name.
You
in verse
can do that
15.
whenever
Which
you want.
verse?
He gives his name just right around the same, in verse 15, when,
Yeah,
say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, that's Yahweh, that's his name.
yeah. Well,
Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac,
Yeah,
God of Jacob, has sent me to you.
yeah.
Who gets
We'll
his
get there
name
shortly. All right, so, where am I? All right, so by the end of verse 14, when God says, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you, this is still not his name, right?
Okay.
This is a form of the verb to be. In Hebrew, it is HYH. Okay, this is a form of the verb to be. Then in 15, God also says to Moses, say to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers. And when you see the Lord in the Bible in all caps, it is the word HYWH. No, wait a minute, did I spell that wrong? YH.
Why is
Yeah.
Yahweh.
Okay. See, I don't know Hebrew.
We don't.
Okay, YHWH, right?
And I think, is the other one also Y, look, is the other one HIH, or is it?
Yeah, it's HYH.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay, so both the Hebrew word for I am, HYH, and YHWH come from the same verb root. Okay? Now, God says further in verse 15, as Andy already said, he said, this is my name forever. YHWH is God's name. And it is a deliberate play on words of the verb I am. And God is saying, every time you hear this name, you're to make this association because it proclaims my essential nature.
Gotcha.
So, what does the name mean, and how do we get to Yahweh? Well, based upon the association with the verb I am, the guesses are something like truly he who is, or he who brings into being. Now, Hebrew words don't have vowels, so pronouncing them can be difficult. But if the first vowel sound in this word is an ah sound, as in it starts with Yah, it means it has a causative sense, meaning to cause to be. And the implication, it implies the meaning of Yahweh could be he who causes to be.
Creator.
Yeah, and in terms of meaning, that's about as good as one can get, as I've been able to find anyway. So how do we get to Yahweh? Well, historically, the Jews did not speak the name of God out loud. And in some conservative Jewish circles, even today they don't. It was considered too sacred to utter. So instead of saying what they thought Yahweh sounded like, one would say Adonai, which means my Lord. And this leads to the Lord being traditional rendering of YHWH in English Bibles. And somewhere along the line, scribes began adding marks for vowel sounds, the vowel sounds in Adonai to YHWH. And this led to the pronunciation of Yehovah or Jehovah, which is very unlikely to be the correct pronunciation. And in the end, no one really knows how YHWH is to be pronounced. However, biblical scholars have settled on Yahweh as the closest that anyone can get. It might not be correct, but it's closer than Jehovah. Now, one last thing about the names of God's here before we move on. Now, sometimes God's had a secret name, and knowing the name of the God gave one who knew the name certain special powers that they could invoke to bring on the power of that God. But Yahweh's name was not to be kept secret. The Hebrews from now on were to know that name and the implications of that name, and they were to make his name known to the world, that the world would know there is a God in Israel. Now, in verse 16, God gives Moses his first set of marching orders. He tells them to go to the elders of Israel, and notice that God now calls them Israel. Tell them I have appeared to you. So God is already identifying them as a nation. Now, to distinguish himself from all the other gods, he identifies himself as the same God worshipped by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Again, he is not an Egyptian God. And he instructs Moses to tell the elders that this God knows all about their plight. See, Matt, can you read 17 through 22?
Sure. And I have been promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt and into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hippites, and Jebusites, land flowing with milk and honey. How far?
Go all the way to 22.
Okay. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians.
This is actually a continuation of verse 16. God's still telling Moses what to say to the elders of Israel, that he will bring them out and into a prosperous land of all these people groups. And then he tells Moses exactly what's going to happen. And says that when he goes to Pharaoh with this request, the king will refuse it. After all, Pharaoh thinks of himself as a god and has the ultimate power in Egypt over the people. And for Moses to make a request in the name of the God of the Hebrews, Pharaoh was just going to laugh it off.
Right.
Now this is power against power, and Pharaoh has the upper hand. At least he thinks he does. Now because after all, if the Hebrews do in fact have an additional God that Pharaoh doesn't know about, he certainly can't be very powerful. Because look what he's done for the Hebrew slaves. Absolutely nothing. So why should Pharaoh honor their request? This request is kind of interesting. God instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh they needed to go into the wilderness to worship their God. And it doesn't say what wilderness they're requesting, because once you get 2 miles away from the Nile, as you've seen, it's wilderness in every direction.
Yeah.
And they want to go 3 days out into this? How absurd. And by saying they need to go off by themselves out of the populated areas in order to worship, they're saying they can't do that here among the Egyptians and their gods. And festivals and feasts to one's God were common in ancient circles, and these feasts usually were held at the place where people supposed that the gods dwelt, either at temples or on mountaintops. And so the implication here is that the place where God resides is not among the Egyptians. And God has called a mountain in Horeb the mountain of God. And we're going to learn in verse 8 that according to Moses, their sacrifices would be detestable to the Egyptians. There was something about their sacrifices that the Egyptians would not like. And I think the nature of this,
Is it 3 days away, Mount Horeb?
it was about that far.
Oh, okay.
I think it took them a week. Something sticks in my brain. It took them a week. We'll learn more when we get there. But, yeah. So I think the nature of the request here is deliberate on God's part to anger Pharaoh and to ensure that he's going to say no. And besides that, Pharaoh's not going to lose his slave workforce for the amount of time it would take for the Hebrews to accomplish this. Time to get prepared, 3 days out, and some specified amount of worship time, and then 3 days back. But I want you to notice something that only one of my sources mention here. In the request God tells Moses to make to Pharaoh, he never mentions anything about returning.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, Moses knew they would not be returning, and it's possible that it was understood by Pharaoh that they were not intending to return.
It's not round trip.
Yeah, so you can make that of what you will here. But then God goes on to tell Moses, the only way Pharaoh's going to let them go is if something compels them to do it. And it's going to be God's power that will accomplish this. Now, ancient Egyptian texts often describe Pharaoh's power by saying he's destroyed his enemies by his strong arm or his strong hand. And God's going to show not only the Hebrews, but the Egyptians, that his power is far greater than Pharaoh's. And not only that, but when God brings the Hebrews out, they will have plundered Egypt. Now this is a pretty amazing thing for God to say, because plundering was only accomplished by military victory over one's enemies. And God was going to do this strictly by his own power and not anything the Hebrews were able to do. God will create a situation where all they have to do is ask for the silver and gold. And that's power. So figuratively, they will be leaving Egypt as conquerors. God does not need our power to accomplish his purposes. He only needs our availability. The power is his. And we know what God's going to do with the silver and gold. He's going to have them make a tabernacle. Okay, chapter 4. Where do we leave off? Matt, Andy, you want to read 1 through 9, please?
Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. How far am I reading?
To 9.
Again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these 2 signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground.
So even all this explanation in chapter 3, Moses comes up with excuse number 2. The first attempt to get out of all this was, who am I? And God countered with, I'll be with you, meaning it will be God's working that will cause these things to happen to Moses, not anything Moses has done or is. So excuse number 2 is, they're not going to believe me. They'll say this is just too far out. And so God's response is to show Moses 3 tricks that will not only convince him of God's power, but the elders of the Hebrews as well. The first thing begins with God's question, what is in your hand? Now, God's plan for our lives, whatever one brings to the fight's enough for God. He can use whatever we bring. And so Moses, he says to Moses, Moses says, my staff, that's all I have to offer. But the staff was important to Moses since it was the one he needed in the sheep tending business. But God says, throw it away. I don't even need that. So when Moses relinquishes it, the only thing he had of any value, it turns into a snake. Now, when I was a kid, the boys in our neighborhood used to hunt these little garter snakes. And we put them in jars, put holes in the lids, grass in there, and maybe a few bugs if we could catch them. Of course, the snakes would always die anyway. But I think the reason we hunted snakes is because they were the most ferocious thing in the neighborhood. Even though they were completely harmless.
Can I tell you something, Mike?
Yes.
When I lived in Springfield at around 8, just before I turned 8 years old, I always tried to catch garden snakes. Same kind, black, about maybe this long.
Yellow racers.
Yep, and I always named them Bob. Every one of them. Every one.
There were a lot
A
of
lot of
balls.
bobs.
Yeah, but I always let them go because I didn't want to keep them. But I didn't want them in my home, but it was still fun to catch them.
Oh, sure. Yeah, but even though these snakes are harmless, when one first sees them, they have kind of a shock value. And one of us would yell, snake, and everybody would jump back. So Moses does exactly what I would have done. He turned around and he ran. Now, one thing we learned from our snake hunting was that you never grab a snake by the tail because they turn and bite you. And even though, garter snakes have a harmless bite, it was still a shock when they do that. But God tells Moses to do the very thing Moses knew not to do. A little test of faith, maybe? But Moses doesn't. And I guess it's a good idea to obey anyone who can talk out of a burning bush that doesn't burn up. and so we know what happens. The snake turns back into a staff. And sometimes God leads us on a path that doesn't make sense to us. And we wonder why he's doing that. But God doesn't ask us to make sense of it. He only asks that we trust him and follow in faith. So why a snake, you might ask? The snake, particularly cobras, were a symbol of Egyptian royalty. You see that. If you look at the headdresses on the pharaohs, you'll see the snake, the cobra there. And maybe God is indicating that he has greater power and control over that. Now in verse 5, God tells Moses the point of this exercise is to convince the elders of the very thing that Moses fears, that they won't believe that their God has shown up, and that he has first appeared to Moses of all people. It's like an announcement, I'm back, but of course we know he never really left. Then God says it's time for trick number 2. So he tells Moses to put his hand into his outer garment. Now this is a lot easier than grabbing a snake by the tail. So Moses does it, and Moses miraculously gets a rash. And this is something that would have been horrifying to Moses. And his rashes, skin conditions were a very serious thing in those days, and they were feared. But his hand was miraculously healed, and this had to be a bit of a relief. But God lets Moses know, if the elders aren't convinced by trick number 1, trick number 2 ought to do it, but if that fails to work, I have one more up my sleeve, and that was trick number 3. That was the water of the Nile being turned into blood. Now, to the Egyptians, the Nile was life. And blood to the Hebrews was symbolic of life and death. And God has the power of life and death. Now, these signs, God previews the plagues that he's going to bring onto Egypt. These involve creatures of the earth. We see that in the snake. People, Moses' hand, and elements of nature, the water of the Nile. Let's see. David, do you have a spot there? Can you read 10 through 17?
Yep. Moses said to the Lord, "O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak, and I will teach you what to say." But Moses said, "O Lord, please send someone else to do it." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak, and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth, and if you were God to him."
One more verse.
Oh, please. "But take his staff
Take what?
Take this staff in your hand, so you can perform the miraculous signs with it."
When the first 2 excuses fail to work, Moses tries excuse number 3. I am not a good speaker. Now, I don't know where this comes from, but one commentator states that magicians who were Pharaoh's advisors prided themselves on their eloquent powers of speech. And so Moses could have been raising an important issue here. If he was going to address the Pharaoh, his ability to speak was not in their league, and he would have sounded like a bumbling idiot. And it could also mean that he thought he would have trouble with the Egyptian language, since he probably hadn't used it in 40 years. But God says, hold on a minute. He says, "Who do you think made your mouth? I know everything about your mouth. In fact, I know all about being deaf, mute. I know all about being able to see or be blind. Now, didn't you just see the snake and the leper's hand tricks? Don't you realize I can do whatever I want? I have control over all these things. Now get going and take your staff with you."
It's interesting that humility goes so far as to become, now I doubt your ability, God, to do what you said you can do. I doubt that. And it's interesting because it's like the words of God are very patient up to a point, and then when it becomes, God says, and he uses this phrase in verse 12 and in 15, I, even I, at least that's how the NASB translates it, but a very emphatic statement, saying, I, even I, will do this. Do you get it? And it's like, that's great, Lord. Can you have somebody else do it? Because I don't think I can do it. And it's like, it's where it becomes, I don't think you can do it, God. And it becomes now doubt. And even though God goes way out to make it emphatic, it's like, I still doubt your ability to do this. And then God says, then God just moves on to the next. And I just wonder if sometimes there's opportunities that God places in our path, and it's like, yeah, no. I don't wanna do that. I don't wanna go speak to this person, or I don't want to do this, or I don't wanna take this responsibility on. And it's almost like where humility goes way beyond humility and just becomes, I don't wanna do it, or I don't trust your ability to do what you say you can do, so I'm gonna pass God on this one.
Yeah.
And then God, and it's like, I think if it goes on long enough, God says, okay, I'll go to the next person who will get it done. But one way or another, it's going to get done, and you can be a part of that or you cannot. It's like, I think, there's like a decision point, and it's interesting that God expresses the frustration at that point, and not before.
So, well, anyway, God tells Moses, he says, get going. He says, I can make your mouth speak any way it needs to.
Yeah,
And once again, God has a plan, and he can overcome any barrier to that plan. You know, so when we come up against what appears to be a barrier, it's only a problem for us. It's not a problem for God.
no,
God's
no.
either gonna use the barrier to change our direction,
Yeah.
or he's gonna overcome that barrier. And maybe he will even use some of our tools to do it.
Mhm.
Now, in verse 13, Moses, like you said, Harvey, he finally just blurts out what he's trying to get across in all of this excuse making, as if God didn't know.
Yeah,
He says, "Oh,
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Can I
oh,
inform you,
oh,
God?"
please, send somebody else, I don't wanna go. And so, you know, up until now, Moses had used the excuses that God could counter. And it doesn't appear that God is too upset with Moses
No.
yet, but he's finally had enough. And he's not gonna show him any more tricks.
Maybe when doubt becomes disobedience.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the point, yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, so God tells Moses that he's gonna have Aaron be his spokesman, and God knows that Aaron can speak well, and maybe Moses does too, we don't know, but God is not gonna let Moses out of his job as the leader of his people, but to speak through Aaron what God tells him to speak. He is still to be God's shepherd and the prophet to his people.
Yeah.
So when God says to Moses, when God says that Moses is to be as God to Aaron, he is setting up the same relationship that a prophet would have with God. God tells the prophet what to speak, and the prophet speaks it, no more and no less. And Moses is going to tell from God what Aaron is to speak, and Aaron is going to do it. And God will make sure that they both understand these roles by teaching them both what to do. And by the way, take your staff with you because you're going to